Some of your synovial joints are going to have extra structures because they have extra needs right here, right? So we'll kind of talk a little, we'll go into a little more detail about your knee and your shoulder joint, because your knee is facing all sorts of unique pressures based on the shape of the two bones, as well as being some of the major load-bearing joints of your body right here. And your shoulder, it being very mobile, also has a lot of extra structures that are going to be involved in that joint cavity. So when I talked about the extra and internal capsular ligaments on the lateral and medial side right here, you have these fibular and tibial collateral ligaments, otherwise known as your lateral and medial collateral ligaments, that are connecting the femur with the fibula or the tibia over here. Right? So these are dense, regular connective tissue connecting those two bones right there. You also, within the joint cavity right here, you have the anterior cruciate ligament. You know this as the ACL probably. And then you have your posterior cruciate ligament. These two are kind of preventing back and forth movement of the knee. These two are preventing lateral movement over here, supporting that knee. So these are extra and internal capsular ligaments. All right, so the knee, along with those ligaments, extra ligaments right here, also has a couple more structures that we're going to see to deal with the rather major instability you'll find in it and some of the problems we see associated with knee. So some complex joints are going to have these extra structures, bursa, articular disc, and these ligaments here. The next structure right here are these little pads called bursa, as well as tendinous sheaths right here. And this is a fibrous, that is dense, irregular connective tissue. And it's kind of like your articular capsule because it's got synovial fluid on the inside, but you could think of them as like little hacky sacks that are placed in between bones, in between muscles, in between tendons, and they're going to move along with movement of those to prevent friction where they would otherwise rub up against each other. Here is a little subacromial bursa underneath in between your humerus and your scapula right here. And as you move in between those, the relative movement, the friction is decreased because of this bursa in between them. And you can think of, put your two hands together if you had like a squishy rubber ball or something in between them, how there would be less friction. Right? All right, and then the other ones, which has the exact same structural makeup here, but they're longer and they're surrounding some tendons over here, are these tendon sheaths. Right, so here's the tendon of your biceps brachii muscle, which goes up through this groove over here. And as your muscle moves, it's moving back and forth. So this tendinous sheath protects it. So here's another example of tendinous sheaths going through your wrist joint. Over here, you have this region right over here where all your tendons of your muscles are going into your hand. Those are all covered with tendinous sheaths. When you get an inflammation of those tendinous sheaths from certain types of activity, like typing, working on your computer all day, the angle starts, these become inflamed and they start pressing on this median nerve right here. Right? That gives you carpal tunnel syndrome. So besides the bursa, we have what is called a fibrocartilage discs. And this is within the synovial joint. This is distinct from those symphysis that we saw earlier, like the intervertebral discs, which are a particular structure, right? These are within the synovial cavity, and they're sort of like creating actually two little cavities right here to sort of allow contouring between the two bones right here, especially as they move relative to each other. All right, so these are fibrocartilage pads. This example right here is your TMJ, your temporal mandibular joint. Right, here's your condylar process fitting into your mandibular fossa. And this is the ligament going over from your condylar process, which will go into this articular disc right here. So what this does is as your jaw moves, as the jaw joint, as this condylar process moves relative, as you're talking, as you're moving your jaw, this is going to kind of move along with it, right? So Here's that TMJ. Here's that fibrocartilage pad. As your jaw moves forward, this moves with it and prevents that sort of otherwise smashing up against each other right there. All right, so that's your fibrocartilage pad. Here's some conditions known with that. If it gets stuck a little bit as your jaw moves forward, sometimes it gets stuck there, and then when your condylar process moves back, it creates a little clicking noise right here. The other problem here is sometimes this gets stuck right over here, and then your jaw actually gets stuck behind the cartilage right over here. That's lockjaw. So those are fibrocartilage pads. And here's another one, the named one called the menisci. So you have your lateral and a medial menisci forming these cup-shaped structures which act as a cushion between the two surfaces, stabilize the knee medial and laterally, and also conforms to the articulating surfaces as the femur moves. All right, so that is the knee joint. And for your shoulder joint, I want to get into the naming of ligaments. All right, so these extra ligaments, there'd be a joint capsule inside holding your humerus to your scapula. And then you haven't learned all these names yet, maybe, of your scapula right here, but this process is called the coracoid process. This is called your acromion process, and here's your clavicle right here. So when we get into the naming of ligaments, knowing these names are crucial, right? It's also important to know that right under here where the humeral head fits in is called the glenoid fossa. This region right here, and this is your humerus. So the ligaments that connect the two are called your glenohumeral ligaments. Okay, so ligaments are named like this. They're named logically for the bone features that they're connected to. All right, so your coracoclavicular, right, so your coracoid process and your clavicle are connected by your coracoclavicular ligaments. Your acromion and your clavicular are attached by your acromioclavicular ligament. Coracoid process and your acromion process are connected by this coracoacromial ligament. Now these are both part of your scapula here. They're just forming this bridge for tendons and muscles and your bursa to kind of sit under to provide a little more structure. But all these ligaments you can see, once you know the bone features, the ligaments are actually logically named. These ligaments you can see, once you know the bone features, the ligaments are actually logically named. So those extra ligaments are going to help with the stabilization of that fairly unstable shoulder joint. And part of the reason it is unstable is because the glenoid fossa, that is the socket of the ball and socket, is very shallow, which in part is why it's so mobile. On the other hand, for the hip joint, the femoral head fits into a much deeper pocket of the acetabulum for the hip joint, and so is a lot more stable. So the shape of the adjoining bones contributes a lot to both the mobility and the lack of stability, and the presence of extra ligaments stabilizes the joint as well. So last, something we didn't discuss here but very important is the presence of a muscle tone securing the joint, holding it tight into its socket, and we'll talk more about that when we get to rotator cuff muscles.